he laughed. Not a quiet, private laugh, but a broad, ringing, performative sound that cut clean across the gilded banquet hall and turned a dozen heads in an instant. Just a servant? Roland's eyes swept over her plain gray dress, her pinned-back hair, the silver tray balanced in her hands. My God, Mireille, how extraordinarily fitting. He said it the way a man says something he has been saving, loudly, with relish, for an audience. His new wife, Portia, laughed at his shoulder, diamonds catching the candlelight, her eyes moving over Mireille with the slow, satisfied contempt of a woman who has already won. Roland had absolutely no idea that the broad-shouldered man seated at the head of the banquet table, the one who had just set down his crystal glass with a deliberate click, and had not looked away from Roland's face since the moment the laugh began, was not merely the most feared duke in England. He was her husband. The spring of 1815 was meant to be the season of Lady Mireille Ashton's greatest joy. As the only daughter of the Earl of Brackenvale, she possessed everything that mattered in Regency England. A respectable dowry, carefully preserved across 3 generations. A bloodline that could be traced without embarrassment to the court of Charles II, and a quiet, dark-eyed beauty that had made her the subject of considerable admiration since her very first season. More importantly, she possessed the devotion, or so she believed, of Lord Roland Vane, Viscount Crestfield. Their engagement had been the crowning social event of the previous autumn. Roland was everything the ton celebrated. Broad-shouldered, quick-witted, possessed of a smile that arrived like sudden sunshine, and a charm so effortless it felt almost like sincerity. He whispered promises into Mireille's ear at every ball they attended. Promises of a future so brilliant she could almost see it, shimmering just ahead of them like light on water. She believed every word. But England's aristocratic society is a creature of pure appetite, and it does not grieve for the fallen. It simply steps over them and moves on. In the space of 3 devastating weeks, Mireille's world did not merely crack, it dissolved entirely. Her father, when the Earl of Brackenvale, a man of enormous personal warmth and catastrophically poor financial instinct, had staked the family's entire fortune on a series of private investment schemes that collapsed simultaneously in February, brought down by a combination of fraudulent partners and a catastrophic run on a private lending bank. The debts that surfaced in the aftermath were staggering, layered, compounding, and entirely secret, hidden from the family for the better part of a decade behind a facade of careful, cheerful normalcy. The Earl, confronted with the totality of his ruin and wholly unable to bear the weight of it, suffered a severe apoplexy in his study on a gray Tuesday morning and did not recover. Mireille was left with nothing, no fortune, no estate, and no staff beyond a single loyal housemaid who refused to leave without her wages, which Mireille could not pay. And, as she discovered with a swiftness that still occasionally woke her at 3 a.m, no fiancé. The mourning black on her gown was barely pressed when Roland Vane appeared at the door of her temporary lodgings in Holborn. He did not bring flowers. He did not remove his greatcoat. He stood in the center of her small, cold sitting room with the brisk efficiency of a man attending to an administrative matter, and withdrew his suit in 4 sentences. "You must understand this is not personal, Mireille," Roland had said, his voice carrying the careful warmth of a man who has rehearsed exactly how sympathetic to sound. A man of my obligations cannot build a future on a foundation that no longer exists. My family's name requires stability, not scandal and debt. I think, if you are honest with yourself, you understand completely. Mireille had stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, and said nothing. Because the pride that her father had spent 20 years building into the architecture of her spine would not permit her to beg a man who had already decided. "I wish you every happiness," Roland added, turning for the door. "I understand there are respectable households that take on companions of good breeding. You still have that, at least." He was engaged to Portia Glynn, the only daughter of the North's most prosperous textile magnate, within the month. Within a fortnight of Roland's departure, the last pretense collapsed. The solicitors came in pairs, then in groups, arriving at the Holborn lodgings with leather satchels and carefully neutral expressions that Mireille quickly learned to read as the particular professional sympathy of men delivering verdicts they have delivered many times before. The debts were not merely large, they were architectural, built into the very foundation of everything the Brackenvale name had stood upon for a decade. The estate in Somerset was mortgaged twice over. The London townhouse had been quietly signed away 3 years prior. Even the contents of her father's study, the walnut desk, the Turkish carpet, the portrait of her mother above the fireplace, belonged, technically, to creditors whose names Mireille had never heard until now. She sat through each meeting with her hands folded and her face composed, because there was nothing else to do. Society, and to its credit, did not make a spectacle of her ruin. It simply ceased to see her. Invitations stopped arriving. Morning callers discovered prior engagements. The women who had competed for the chair beside hers at Almack's developed a sudden collective difficulty meeting her eyes at the few modest events she still attended. It was not malice, it was arithmetic. Mireille Ashton no longer added up to anything useful, and so she was quietly subtracted from every calculation. By April, she had sold the last of her mother's jewelry. Kept back from the creditors by a sympathetic solicitor's clerk who looked the other way, and was living on the proceeds with the careful, joyless precision of a woman who knows exactly how long the money must last. It was her father's former man of business, old Mr. Hewitt, who came to her on a Thursday morning with his hat in his hands and an expression of cautious hope. There was a position, he said, a serving post at Aldenmore, the private estate of the Duke of Aldenmore, the great house in Wiltshire that society spoke of in the hushed, slightly awed tones usually reserved for cathedrals and warships. The Duke himself was abroad, on crown business in Paris. The household was well run, the wages were generous, and the position had been quietly set aside for a woman of good breeding who required discretion as much as employment. Mireille asked no questions about how Mr. Hewitt had come to know of it. She packed what remained of her possessions into a single trunk, said goodbye to the one housemaid who had stayed without pay until the end, and took the post. So she did not know, could not have known, that the position had not come to Mr. Hewitt by accident, that the careful chain of quiet arrangements leading to her arrival at Aldenmore had been set in motion from Paris. by a man who had been watching her with steady, patient attention for 2 years, and had decided that enough was enough. He returned from Paris on a Thursday, 6 days after Mireille arrived at Alden Moor, and she did not know he was in the house until Mr. Tell appeared at the kitchen door that evening and told her, with the unhurried calm of a man for whom nothing was ever particularly surprising, that his Grace would see her in the study at 8 o'clock. She had expected a large man. The word duke carried a certain physical expectation. Broad, loud, conscious of the space he occupied. A Lucien d'Avre was none of those things. He was lean and dark-haired, with close-cropped silver at his temples, and the kind of absolute stillness that Mireille had previously only observed in cats and chess players of exceptional ability. He was standing at the window when she entered, his back partially to her, reading a dispatch by the last of the evening light, and he finished it before he turned around, which told her more about him than an hour of conversation might have. He gestured to the chair across from the fire. He poured the tea himself, without calling for anyone, without making a ceremony of it, and set the cup in front of her with the straightforward practicality of a man who finds performative helplessness in others faintly embarrassing. Then he sat, looked at her directly with eyes the precise color of November fog, and spoke. He knew about her father's debts, all of them, including the ones the sympathetic clerk had tried to shield her from. He had purchased them 6 weeks ago, quietly and completely, through 3 intermediaries specifically chosen to ensure the transaction was untraceable back to him. He told her this not as a threat and not as a gift, but simply as a fact she deserved to have, stated plainly, before anything else was said. Mireille kept her hands still in her lap and her eyes on his face and said nothing, because she had learned recently that silence was frequently more dignified than the alternatives. "I have a proposal," Lucien said. "Not charity. I want to be precise about that from the beginning. What I am describing is an alliance between 2 people who each have something the other requires. He needed a wife. We said, not for companionship, not for appearances in the ordinary social sense, but for the specific political reason that a man of his particular influence, with his particular enemies, was significantly more vulnerable unmarried than married. His opponents in government were not above using personal exposure as leverage. He intended to give them nothing to hold. I need a wife of real character, he said. Not performance, not pedigree alone, character. His gray eyes did not move from hers. Marry me in secret. 1 season, while I conclude the final Paris commission. When I return, I will bring you out before all of England. A pause, precise and deliberate. The people who laughed will not be laughing. Mireille looked at this man who had purchased her father's debts and arranged her employment and returned from Paris and poured her tea without fanfare, and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives after a long period of seeing things exactly as they are, that whatever else Lucien d'Avre might be, he was not performing. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said. They were married 4 days later, at midnight, in Alden Moor's private chapel. It was a small, ancient room at the far edge of the east wing, stone-walled, candle-lit, smelling of beeswax and cold air, and the particular stillness of a space that had absorbed 3 centuries of Davra family prayers. Mr. Tal stood to the left of the altar with his hands clasped and his expression composed, and as though witnessing secret midnight weddings was simply another item on a well-managed household schedule. The vicar was a small, precise man from the village who had served the Aldenmore estate for 30 years and clearly understood that his tenure depended on a discretion so absolute it bordered on the ecclesiastical. Lucian spoke his vows with the same quiet directness he brought to everything. No flourish, no performance. Simply the words said, as though he meant them, which Mireille was beginning to understand was the only way he knew how to say anything. He slid the Aldenmore ring onto her finger, a deep green emerald set in brushed gold, the precise color of the parkland visible from the chapel's narrow window on a clear morning. And then, without pausing, lifted it back off and threaded it onto a fine gold chain, which he clasped around her neck himself, his fingers steady and unhurried at the back of her collar. "Keep it there," he said quietly, "until I come back." He left for Paris before dawn. Mireille stood at the window of her small servant's room and watched the carriage lamps disappear down the long drive, and his last words at the carriage door settled around her like something solid in an otherwise unsolid world. "One season, Mireille, not one day more. When you hear my name announced, you will know it is over." The months that followed were the hardest of her life. They were also, in ways she had not expected, clarifying. She served. She carried trays and polished silver and stood invisibly at the edges of rooms where people with titles and fortunes talked freely because they had forgotten, or had never noticed, that she was there. She endured the head housekeeper's brisk impatience and the other servants' cautious curiosity, and the occasional visiting guest who looked through her with the practiced ease of long habit. And she read Lucian's letters. They arrived by private courier every 2 to 3 weeks. Single pages, written in a hand that was spare and slightly angular, the sentences short and precise. He reported on the Paris negotiations with the economical frankness of a man writing to an equal. He asked in each letter a single specific question about something she had mentioned in her previous reply, which told her he had read her words carefully and retained them. There was more genuine attention in 3 paragraphs of Lucian's correspondence than Roland had managed across 18 months of ardent courtship, and Mireille held that knowledge quietly and found it steadying. She held herself together with both hands and did not put the tray down. Then, on a gray Wednesday morning in November, Mr. Tal set the confirmed banquet guest list on the kitchen table beside her breakfast, his expression one of such perfectly calibrated neutrality that it communicated everything his face was carefully not saying. She read down the list until she found it. Lord Roland Vane, Viscount Crestfield. Lady Portia Vane, confirmed attending. Mireille read it once. She set the paper down. She picked up her serving tray, and she went back to work. The night of the Aldenmore winter banquet arrived with the particular magnificence that only Lucian's household, operating at full capacity, could produce. 500 candles burned across 3 chandeliers and a dozen candelabras, throwing warm gold light across tables laden with silver dish covers and crystal that caught and scattered the flame into 1,000 small fires. The guest list represented a significant portion of England's functioning power. 3 earls, 2 viscounts, a Scottish duke of ancient lineage, the French ambassador and his attaché, and a scattering of the government's most consequential minds, all of them talking with the comfortable ease of people who had never once in their lives carried a tray. Mireille moved between them like water finding its level. Quiet, practiced, invisible in the way she had spent 6 months perfecting. Roland found her at the precise moment she was passing behind the second table, tray level, navigating the narrow space between a viscount's chair and a potted laurel. She heard him before she saw him. That laugh is still exactly as she remembered it, broad and self-congratulatory and calibrated for reach. Serving food now, Mireille? He had positioned himself with the instincts of a man who understood audiences, placed so that 3 earls and the French ambassador were within effortless earshot. His smile was the one she had once believed was made for her alone. "I always said you'd find your place eventually." Portia's laugh came immediately, high and bright and carrying, her diamonds catching the candlelight as her eyes moved over Mireille with slow, absolute satisfaction. Mireille stood perfectly still. She kept the tray level. She kept her eyes on Roland's face with an expression of such complete and genuine composure that she noticed, distantly, several of the nearby guests shift with a discomfort they could not have named. The particular unease of people watching someone absorb a blow and simply not fall. She did not speak. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she could feel it. A change in the quality of the room's atmosphere, subtle as a pressure drop before a storm. The specific stillness that descends when a large space realizes it is no longer directing its own proceedings. At the head of the longest table, Lucien set down his crystal glass. The sound was small and precise, and somehow carried. He did not stand abruptly. He did not raise his voice or catch anyone's eye. He simply rose, with the unhurried completeness of a man for whom the outcome of the next 5 minutes has never been in any doubt, and began to walk the length of the table. The silence followed him like a tide. The conversations closest to him ceased first, mid-sentence, mid-laugh, then the ones beyond, then the ones beyond those, the quiet spreading outward through the blazing hall in concentric rings, until the only sounds were the candles and the faint shift of 300 people collectively holding their breath. He stopped beside Mireille. He reached beneath her collar, unclasped the chain in a single motion, and slid the emerald ring onto her finger with the calm finality of a man completing something that was always going to end this way. Then he took the silver tray from her hands and set it on the nearest table, gently, without drama, as though relieving her of something she should never have been asked to carry, and tucked her hand into the crook of his arm. He looked at Roland Vane once, just once, and briefly, with the expression of a man who has noticed something unremarkable on the sole of his boot. "I don't believe you've been formally introduced to my wife." The silence that followed was total and devastating. Portia's champagne flute tipped sideways, spilling in a slow, silent arc across the white tablecloth. Roland's mouth opened. No sound arrived. The French ambassador, to his considerable credit, managed to set down his fork without dropping it. Lucien held the moment for 5 exact seconds, long enough for every person in the room to complete the same calculation and arrive at the same staggering conclusion, and then turned away from Roland entirely. his attention moving to Mireille with a completeness that made the Viscount's existence feel suddenly theoretical. His voice, when he spoke, dropped to something quiet and unhurried and entirely for her. "I believe I promised you this would be over." The grey eyes were steady and warm and faintly, privately rueful. "Forgive the extra week." Paris was stubborn. Roland did not retreat gracefully. Cornered men rarely do. Within 4 days of the banquet, the gentlemen's clubs of St. James were circulating a story, carefully worded, never quite attributed, passed between leather armchairs and brandy glasses with the practiced casualness of people who understand that the most damaging rumors are the ones that sound like reluctant concern. The whisper was consistent in its details, that Mireille Ashton, a disgraced servant of questionable character, had deliberately positioned herself to exploit a politically distracted duke during a period of vulnerability. Oh, and that the secret nature of the marriage raised questions that any reasonable legal mind would find worth examining. The intelligence summary reached Lucien on a Friday morning. He read it at the breakfast table, turned the last page over with the same expression he might bring to a mildly disappointing weather report, and looked across at Mireille with complete tranquility. "He has made his move," Lucien said. "It is the only move he had." A pause, brief and absolute. "It is not enough." What Roland Vane had fatally failed to account for was the nature of the man he had chosen to provoke. Lucien's intelligence network had not been assembled overnight. It was the product of a decade of Crown service, built quietly, maintained carefully, and kept entirely invisible to everyone except the small number of people whose continued loyalty Lucien had earned through the simple mechanism of never once betraying them. From the night of the banquet onward, that network had been doing what it did with the patient thoroughness of a mechanism that does not require supervision. The dossier that landed on the Home Secretary's desk the following Monday morning was comprehensive, precise, and entirely damning. Edmund Glynn, Portia's father, Roland's financial foundation, the source of every comfort the Vane household had enjoyed since the wedding, had been systematically bribing customs inspectors at 3 southern ports to clear undeclared continental imports without levy. The fraud was not incidental. It was structural, deliberate, and conducted on a scale that constituted a serious criminal matter against the Crown. By Wednesday, Glynn's warehouses were under seizure pending investigation. By Thursday, Portia's dowry, the entire sum of it, held in instruments directly tied to her father's now frozen assets, was inaccessible. By Friday, Roland's creditors, whose patience had been extended entirely on the strength of that fortune, had collectively and simultaneously run out of it. Crestfield Manor went to forced sale in under 3 weeks. Roland and Portia left England shortly thereafter, with the particular haste of people who are not so much departing as evaporating. No farewell calls, no forwarding address, simply an absence where they had been. Mireille learned of it from Mr. Talle, who delivered the information with his customary neutrality and asked whether she required anything further. She said no, thanked him, and stood at the morning room window for a long, quiet moment, looking out at the parkland. Then she went to review the guest list for the Aldenmore winter reception, because there was work to be done. 6 weeks later, Mireille stood at the top of Aldenmore's grand staircase in a gown of deep emerald silk. the Aldenmore jewels cold and magnificent at her throat, and received the Duke of Clarence. He was a large, good-humored man who climbed the steps with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to people waiting for him, took her hand, kissed it with genuine warmth, and turned to address the assembled reception. Lords, ladies, ambassadors, and the full gleaming machinery of English aristocratic society. In a voice designed to reach every corner of a room considerably larger than this one, Lucien d'Avre, the Duke of Clarence announced, has demonstrated, as always, the unerring judgment that has made him indispensable to the crown. The applause was immediate, total, and entirely unambiguous. Mireille stood straight and smiled and let it wash over her, and did not think about the gray dress or the silver tray or the 6 months of carrying both, with hands that she had refused, on principle, to let tremble. Later, after the last carriage had rolled down the lamplit drive and the great house had settled into its nighttime quiet, she slipped out to the east balcony. The parkland below was strung with the remnants of the reception lanterns, still burning in the still air, through their reflections scattered across the ornamental lake like fallen stars. Lucien came to stand behind her, his arms settling around her shoulders with the easy certainty of a man who has finally stopped being careful about what he wants. His chin rested at her temple. The quiet between them was the comfortable kind. "I carried that tray for 6 months," Mireille said eventually, to the parkland and the lanterns and the dark water below. Lucien was still for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and unhurried and absolutely certain. "Every person in that hall tonight bowed to you, not to the title, not to me, to you, because you carried the tray and never once put it down in anger." His arms tightened slightly around her shoulders. "That," he said, "is who you have always been." Mireille closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, believed it. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment of Mireille's quiet endurance and the absolute satisfaction of Roland's destruction, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Hit the like button, leave a comment telling us the moment that got you most, and share this with someone who loves a story where the right person wins in the end. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because we bring you stories exactly like this one every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next.